Lookup functions in Excel are tools used to search for and retrieve data from a table. They allow you to find any piece of information from a data set as long as you have a reference to search with, which we call a lookup value. The most common lookup function that people use is called VLOOKUP. The V stands for vertical. It's going to perform a search by going top down through a column of data. After invoking a VLOOKUP function, the first parameter you have to input is a lookup value. This will often relate to a unique identifier of a dataset, an ID. You can manually type this in, but you'll likely use a cell reference. Next, you specify a table, some two-dimensional array in your dataset, and the leftmost column needs to be the column that contains your lookup value. The other column should contain data you want to retrieve. The last required parameter is a column index number. This is your way of telling Excel of the table you just specified, which column is the one you actually want to pull data from. If it's in the third column of that table going from left to right, the index number would be 3. There is also a non-required option about whether or not to do an approximate versus an exact match. In this class, we're always just going to use exact matches, so to indicate this, you type the word false after the column index number. VLOOKUPs are pervasive. Everybody uses VLOOKUPs. And because of the way that we structure data, this function is going to get the job done in 90+% of situations. But it does come with some limitations. The first is that when you specify that table array, it does require that lookup value to be in that leftmost column. If you want to retrieve data to the left of a lookup value, you're not going to be able to do that with a VLOOKUP function without restructuring, reformatting your data, and that's not desirable. Number 2, you have to specify column index number, and if you're manually hard coding in these numbers, it's going to make it difficult to dynamically copy and paste a formula and bring in additional data. Number 3, it only searches up and down, not side to side. Now there is an analogous function, HLOOKUP, to handle this, but on their own, neither one can do the job of the other. And lastly, this function can be quite slow if your data set is large. So people have tried to be innovative and improve upon VLOOKUPs. Like I mentioned before, there is an HLOOKUP, H standing for horizontal. This is basically identical to VLOOKUPs, except the function does the lookup process from left to right, and it will then return a value going down the column. And like I said before, data tables don't tend to be structured in such a way to make that ever useful. I've never actually seen an HLOOKUP used in practice. Another trick people have implemented with lookup functions is nesting a match function within an index function. Essentially, the match does the lookup process, and the index actually returns the desired data. And this approach is absolutely fine, maybe a little bit less straightforward, but it works. However, I am not going to require you to understand or apply either of those. We're going to be using a relatively new function, XLOOKUP, that is pretty flexible in addressing the limitations of VLOOKUPs. And you're probably thinking, then why the heck are you even mentioning those earlier methods? And the reason is, for anything we learn in this class, you've got to realize that you are joining a workforce that likely learned an older approach and may not be doing things the way that you currently do. I bring these up because if you happen to see an index and match in a spreadsheet that a coworker gives you, you're now going to recognize that this is a legacy way of doing lookups in Excel. And who knows, you might be in a good position to educate your coworkers. But like I say, we're going to work with XLOOKUP. No more V's, no more H's. This function is flexible to doing both methods. This function was released in early 2020, so it's been around for a little bit, but there are still plenty of people that rely on VLOOKUPs for everything they do. This function starts the same as a VLOOKUP. You input a lookup value. But instead of specifying an entire table to search, XLOOKUP has you indicate either the column or row that contains your lookup value. And lastly, you specify the array that holds the data you want to return. XLOOKUP comes with a variety of additional options. I'm not going to go into those in this course. Feel free to look into those more on your own time. There's even more great stuff you can do. But what are the benefits here? What does this mean? It means you can specify columns to the left of the lookup array. It means that if you do your references carefully, You can copy and paste XLOOKUP formulas to bring in multiple columns without having to worry about hard-coded column index numbers. So let's try this out. In this first example, we will be working with a country-level data set. Our ultimate objective is to produce a reference table over here that will dynamically update if we change the country code in cell G5. But before we can do that, our table is incomplete. Column D, which holds population data, is missing. Let's assume new population figures were just released and we need to update this column. This data is stored in the very next sheet, Lookup 1B. So first, we need to populate, pun intended, column D with a lookup function that references the data stored in the other sheet, and then we will create additional lookup function that will pull the data for any given country if we enter a valid country code. So, going to our first task, we have to decide on our approach by identifying what our lookup value is going to be and what we need to retrieve. Going back to the second sheet, we already have country codes. We just need the second column, population. And notice that since the lookup value column is furthest to the left, a basic VLOOKUP will work fine here. So let's start with that. Equals VLOOKUP. My lookup value is the country code, off to the left here in cell C10. Now ask yourself, should this be a relative or absolute reference? Since I want to copy this cell down and reference a different country each time, I'm going to leave it as a relative reference. Okay, so I hit comma. Next, we specify the table we're going to pull data from. It is currently stored in a different sheet. So as I build out this formula, I need to navigate to that next sheet. I can click this tab down here at the bottom, or you can use Excel shortcuts. Hold Control and hit Page Down, and it will take us to the next sheet. Select the entire table. And right now, this is a relative reference. But I don't want this selection to move down as I copy the formula, so hit F4 once to make this an absolute reference. If you look at the formula bar, notice how Excel has indicated that we are working in a different sheet than the destination of the formula. We hit comma. Next is our column index number. It's pretty simple. There are only two columns, and I want the second one. Let's enter 2, hit comma. We'll type false for an exact match, end parenthesis, and hit enter. If we've done everything correctly, we can double-click the fill handle and copy this formula down. Now we work on our reference table above. We want to reference this country code in cell G5 and retrieve all of a given country's data. So let's start with the country name. Notice, in our data table, this field is to the left of our lookup array, the column that holds our country codes. This means that in its current form, we are unable to use VLOOKUP unless we cut and paste columns from our original data set, but we don't want to do that. That's sketchy. Is there a way to do this without changing the original data set? Yes, we will use an XLOOKUP. Like a VLOOKUP, I referenced the country code. Probably wouldn't hurt to make this an absolute reference. Then I specify the lookup array, the column in the data that includes my lookup value. I then specify the column that contains the data I want, column B, and hit enter. Pretty slick. Let's try that again, but now with our newly updated population data. This time, let's see if there's a way we can set up our references carefully to be able to copy our formula to the right. Equals XLOOKUP. My lookup value will be the same as before, but now it's going to be important that I make an absolute reference to cell G5. The lookup array will be the same, but again, I want this to be an absolute reference. Make sure your dollar signs are looking good there. Comma. But now as I specify my return array, this one I'm going to leave as relative. As I copy the formula to the right, I want it to keep returning subsequent columns. So I hit enter, I drag this column to the right, and things are looking pretty good. The instructions say that we can check our work by changing the country code to Canada's, CAN, Oh, and that looks awesome. Can I show you one more thing that XLOOKUP can do? Instead of selecting a single column as my return array in the formula, you can also select an entire array of subsequent columns you want to return. So let's practice and rebuild this one from scratch. Equals XLOOKUP. I'm going to reference the same lookup value, but I'm going to leave it as a relative reference. The lookup array, same thing. We don't need to for what we're about to do. For the return array, I'm going to bring in everything, all the subsequent columns. XLOOKUP knows that once it has identified the row that matches the lookup value I've given it, it will return a value from every column in that return array. This has now become an array function because its output extends to multiple cells. And if I try to delete any of these values, GDP per capita, it won't really let me delete it because its value is based on a precedent cell with an array formula. It won't change unless I modify that original cell. Let's return to an accounting context. Let's say we're doing a bank reconciliation. This is done by taking the cash records at your company, in other words, the amount of cash your company has, based on what your accounting records say, and comparing this with a bank statement, the amount of cash that your bank says you have. While these obviously shouldn't be wildly different numbers, every period you're going to likely have some small differences. Maybe you have cash on hand at the business that you still need to take to the bank. Or maybe you have outstanding checks that your vendors haven't cashed yet. They haven't yet cleared the bank. There could be service fees. Your bank has probably accrued some interest on your accounts. So the bank reconciliation is important just to bring these two sets of records in alignment. On each of these next two sheets, we've got the company and bank records respectively. To help facilitate this exercise, we can rely on these transaction IDs off to the left-hand side. These indicate unique instances of us making deposits or issuing checks, something like that. And we're able to assume that the numbering system between our records and the bank statement will be the same. Let's start by looking at the company records and bringing in information from the bank statement. A VLOOKUP will be fine here. Equals VLOOKUP. My lookup value will be the transaction ID of a given row, left as a relative reference, comma. The table array will be specified on the next sheet. I'll take these three columns, make it an absolute reference, hit comma, and I want the third column, the amount per the bank, column 3, comma false, and there we go. Double click the fill handle to bring this down, and we're golden. We can then subtract the amount per the bank from the amount listed in the company records. If there's no difference, that's great. If we see an error, that means that we have something in our records that could not be found in the bank statement. And any numeric differences, those are items that we're going to have to look into. For instance, this first one, check 1770. It cleared the bank, but why do we have this $6,300 difference? Look carefully at these two numbers, and what do you observe? They're very similar, but the amount per our records includes a 0 in between this initial 7 and 6. That could be a typo on our end, possibly an error by the bank, but I would assume it's more likely our mistake, but we need to go back to our documentation and verify the source of that discrepancy. Coming down, we've got a check 1776 here, where per our records, we have issued that check, but for some reason it hasn't cleared the bank. But if we're doing this reconciliation at the end of the month, that's a whole 20 days that this has been an outstanding check. It's probably time to contact that vendor and find out what's going on. We've got a lot of similar amounts, a couple more checks that haven't yet cleared, but since they're more towards the end of the month, I'm not as concerned about that. The very last line has a deposit, $10,000 that we need to take to the bank still. We know it's cash we have, we just haven't yet deposited it. It's in transit. So that's good. We now understand the sources for any differences between our cash balance per our records and the bank. Well, at least we know half the story. We can't just look at what we've recorded and the bank hasn't. We also need to check what the bank has and we don't. So pause the video now. Try working through on the second sheet. Repeat these same exact steps. See if you can't find out for yourself if there are any other adjustments that need to be made. Okay, let's try this together now. Equals VLOOKUP. Lookup value, still transaction ID, relative reference. The table array, we come back to our company records. Now it doesn't really matter which columns I specify here. I could do the whole thing or just the first three. In the end, making sure I've included the column whose data I want to retrieve, that's what's most important. So I'll take the whole thing here, make it an absolute reference, and I still want column index number 3, comma false, and hit enter. We'll copy this down and take the difference. Let's see if we've done it right. Oh, good. Once again, we've got to check with a $6,300 discrepancy. Oh, that's not good. Until you remember, oh wait, no, this is the one we already saw before. We're already looking into this issue. We scroll down. Uh-oh, the bank has something we don't. What is it? Oh, account fees. The bank has charged us some money to use their account, and that makes sense why it's not yet in our records. Keep scrolling down. The last thing is, oh, we've also earned some interest on our savings account, whatever we've deposited this money into, and so we can update our company records accordingly. Okay, one more opportunity to practice these lookup functions. This time I've given you a data set that's got some information about various actors and actresses. You see, I'm trying to keep your interest level high here. Essentially, this exercise is going to largely mirror what you've done before in Lookup 1A. We're going to build out a reference table such that if we ever update the ID field here, it will retrieve all of that actor's corresponding information. I want you to start by constructing a VLOOKUP function in cell B13 to bring in this actor's name from the table off to the right. After you do that, I want you to use an XLOOKUP to retrieve all of the remaining fields, which are stored in this table in the next sheet. You'll notice the lookup values here are on the far right-hand side, hence the motivation to be doing an XLOOKUP. Of course, you can use those array capabilities I showed you earlier with XLOOKUP to bring in all of the columns at once. But if you want to impress me, and I'm sure you all do, I'd like you to use careful referencing for the lookup value, lookup array, and return array such that you could also copy the formula to the right to bring in each of these fields individually. Once you're done, you can change this ID field to 14508894, and that should bring it in for Angela Lansbury. If you get it on your own, that's great. You can just move on to the next video. But if not, you can unpause me to watch my video solution. Okay, let's work on name equals VLOOKUP. Here's my lookup value, here's my table array. I've left it as relative references because this is a one-shot problem. I'm not going to copy this formula anywhere else. Comma 2 for the second column, comma false. And there we've got Steve Carell. For his age, we'll do equals XLOOKUP. Same spot for my lookup value, but this time I will make it an absolute reference. Since I want to copy this formula, I want to make sure that that reference stays in place. Same thing for my lookup array on the next sheet. Here's the ID field. I don't want that to move, so I hit F4. My return array, I wanted to draw from this first column, age. And you'll notice they proceed in the same order as our reference table from before. I leave this as a relative reference because I do want these to change. So when I hit enter, I'm now prepared to drag this formula to the right, and things are looking pretty good. We could reformat some of these fields, make this a short date, net worth can be in dollars. And now the moment of truth. When I change this to 14508894, looks golden. So you guys, lookup functions are pervasive. You've got to get good at them because they're going to be everywhere in your work. So if you're looking for more opportunities to practice these, don't worry, I've got you covered. Our first case assignment, case 1, will require you to do several lookup functions. So you'll be experts by the time you're done with it.